How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 216 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is one that I'm looking forward to. It's one that I actually should have done last year, and it's with Peter Donegan, who's coming on the podcast for the third time. So we've had a couple of people on for two, but now Peter has stole the lead and he's gone into three, I suppose, appearances on the podcast. So when I say we should have talked about it last year, Peter went last year to the Melbourne International Flower and Garden Show and won gold at that, which was the first Irish designer to go down there and do that, which was a huge achievement. And he's going back this year with a new garden, and a garden with a great story. The garden is themed A Moment in Time, and it's a really good story. I won't mention the story now. Peter can tell us all about it, but it's a really deep story. With a lot of horticultural work in the background to allow it to be delivered at the flower show this year. And yeah, as I say, a great story. So Peter, you're very, very welcome back to Master My Garden podcast.
John, always a pleasure and great to see you again. Genuinely always great to see you again. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. As I say, we should have spoke last year, in truth. You went, just to sort of take a step backward first, you went to Melbourne last year. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the first Irish garden designer to go down there. So tell us about that, the experience. Give us a little bit of an overview. I'm sure people have seen since the garden or heard about the garden, but just a little bit about that story, and then we'll move on to what looks like a spectacular garden for this year.
Well, the Melbourne International Flower and Garden Show is held at the World Heritage UNESCO Carlton Gardens on Royal Exhibition Building, a very prestigious location in Melbourne. So for those who are aware of show gardening, there's no digging down is the first part. And then the second part is that we took the largest show garden at the show last year, which was 200 square meters, 20 by 10. And we put 45,000 liters of water in a timber frame. I'll get to that in a minute. And placed ultimately what Channel 7 News Australia referred to as an Irish love story within the garden. The garden was loosely based on a grown man, in this case Irish, who couldn't say I love you, three magic words, but ultimately waited for the woman of his dreams, his beau, to arrive, but she would never turn up until he said the magic words. And so you're caught in this sort of cyclical hamster wheel of a never-ending story. And when we set the table at the top of the garden, for those who are listening in podcast form, go and Google the Bamstone Garden or Peter Donegan Melbourne, and it'll come up for you. But we left it so that the table setting was, his napkin was used, hers was untouched, his glass was poured with liquid in it, hers was untouched, and a locket awaited on the edge of the garden. And coincidentally, the poem that was written by the edge of the garden, there's a tie-in here in my head somewhere, was the poem that we actually wrote around the edge of the piano in the DIY SOS episode, which was Johnny and Lynn's garden in New Ross, that you would know very well.
Yeah.
And Johnny, coincidentally, I'm segueing here, but Johnny coincidentally passed in the middle of the Melbourne show. The day we got award of gold, he passed away. So it was nice to be able to send Lynn, his wife, a note to say that Johnny was in the garden with us, and to say people walked into that garden with a big smile because the illustration of the garden was exactly what it became. We had a 9 meter, 10 meter tall Liriodendron tulipifera, which had gone into its autumnal color, bouncing across the black water, which ran for approximately 15, 16 meters long, that length, so we could get that reflection in it. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that it was again a grown man. This is where the story was born, standing on Inishmore, looking across to the mainland. And the illogic, if I might put it behind it, is quite simple. as I explained to Chloe Thompson of being there, Doug, that who we both know, logic tells you when it's gale force 10 and you're on Inishmore and your love is on the mainland, I'll wait till tomorrow. The water's a bit choppy. We don't have enough fuel in the boat. And illogic is, I'll go for it. And no woman ever fell in love with a man who folded socks and did practical things. No love story was ever based upon that. So there's a whole sort of a journey there. But I think when you see it, it sort of makes better sense. And to say Melbourne sort of fell in love with that, or people easily identified with that, is probably an understatement. And it won gold. My first time there, working alongside Martin Semken, who's the most medal contractor in the history of the show, and his wonderful family. I was going to say company, but it's a family anyway, a conglomerate, a mafioso, if I may, for all of the right reasons. And yeah, I have to say it was a nice moment.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal achievement because, as I say, there hasn't many gone down there from this neck of the woods. None from Ireland. I'm not sure about the UK, but certainly it's not something that's done very often, I think. The story obviously is relatable, while vaguely related to Inishmore. The essence of the story is relatable to most people. I think that's probably what.
Sorry to cut across you, John, but
right.
the gas thing is I was with Temple Street Children's Hospital, standing on the island, standing on Inishmore, and myself and a couple of friends of mine were literally just chit-chatting. And the photograph we took was the moon bouncing across the water. And when we looked at that, took that photograph, the story then started to evolve. And again, I'll say that it's like a scene from Unbelievables or something like this. Three guys sitting at a bar, just shooting the breeze. And we were sort of saying, can you imagine if your love was on the mainland? And we'd had really bad weather the year before where we almost couldn't get off the island. And that's where the story started to evolve from. And that's what it became. And so that photograph, then we were saying, well, how do you translate that into a garden where it's the moon beating across? And so we changed it to Eclidicea triacanthus sunburst. Sorry for your listeners, apologies. But obviously that doesn't translate to Australia very well.
Yeah.
So we ended up changing that to a Liriodendron tulipifera, which gave that sort of moonlight reflection. And it's only when you see the images of the garden at nighttime that you turn around and go, oh my God. It's exactly as in my head, or at least Martin Semken, who's the contractor, tells me it's the first show garden he has where he has the photograph of the garden during the day and at nighttime next to the illustration of the garden. So like in my head and my heart, that sort of woo, that calling, that want to be with the woman of your dreams. I mean, if you close your eyes and you listen to, pardon me for being mildly romanticizing, if I may, but you either close your eyes and you listen to Otis Redding and you get it, or you turn around and say, would you turn down the volume on that, please? Your mother's trying to cook the dinner. And you become very sort of practical about things. And I get it. Some people get it and some people don't. But hence the ability to be able to translate a daydream into a series of equations and make it only ever appear like a daydream is ultimately what it comes down to. And you can't bluff that amount of Australian media. I don't think you can bluff the Irish. The Irish and the Aussies are extremely similar in their sense of humour and their ability to, as my mother would say it, cut the legs from underneath you when it need be. We would call it that. They would call it tall poppy syndrome. But there's no bluffing hiding room in a space where you've got 120,000 people passing through the gates. And Australia's main garden show, internationally recognised. It either is or it isn't what you say it is. And I think we did okay,
Yeah, for sure. In terms of just, you're talking about 120,000 people passing by. So obviously, you know, from a judging perspective, from the Australian media perspective, the garden was super well received, obviously winning gold, which is a phenomenal achievement. did you get much interaction with the passing public and their thoughts on the garden?
I'd one lady who stands out to me, and she came up to me in a like a walking frame, and she whispered into my ear. She said, "I should have called him back." And I, sorry. And she went, "Are you the Irish guy?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I should have said something." And I said, "I don't understand." And then it transpired that about 50 something years ago, and I'm paraphrasing the story, but to put it into context for your listeners, sometimes she says, or he says in this case, "Well, I'm going." And she goes, "Well, you go on ahead and go on then." And she never called him back. And 50 years later, she decides to tell me because
It relates.
This guy, she, like, who's Peter Donegan when it comes to this? But that this story identifies with her 50 plus years later is just phenomenal. And that was the level that it was at. We had another one of the judges, I think, walked into the garden, and she walked up towards it like a child seeing a circus tent for the first time. Big beam and smile the closer she got to the garden. And when she walked off the garden, she had tears in her eyes. And I said to Martin Semken, I don't know how in my lifetime, I've two gardens maybe where people in France in 2018, when we did the World War I centenary peace garden, to commemorate, my apologies, the centenary of the ending of the First World War, we had people walk in with tears in their eyes. But this is the first one in my lifetime where people plural, walked in smiling and walked out crying. And that kind of is ultimately, that's the ultimate compliment. That's a Hollywood movie wrapped into 200 square meters, if I might pay myself some sort of compliment in what I say we, the conglomerate that made the garden real, managed to make happen. And so when I say the interaction is there, I mean, I've stood in the audience beforehand, John, when we've done show gardens in the past, and I've stood into the audience, and my favorite one, and I won't tell you even which garden, was standing, and this guy, I said to this guy beside me, "What do you think of the garden?" And he went, "I think it's shite." And pardon my French, my apologies. And I said, "I hear the designer's a bit of a pain in the ass." And he went, "Well, it wouldn't surprise me." And like, we're having this conversation about me. And I said this to Andrew Fisher Tomlin, and he said, a former judge in the UK, would run London College of Garden Design. They've got a sister college in Melbourne. And Andrew said to me, he said, "I used to do exactly the same thing." Like, if you want honesty, it's sort of there. But sometimes you hit pardon me, my analogies, but you hit a sort of a Westlife number one. And sometimes it's one of them that's on the fence. And sometimes a garden needs a little bit of controversy, or it's a Marmite. People either love it or hate it, but it's good for the garden because it creates conversation. Mm-hmm. So I don't mind people not liking it. That's as sure as I don't like Shania Twain's music. I'm sure she's a wonderful woman, but I'm not a big fan. If that makes sense, it's okay not to like it, but I think in this one, it was just one of them that people just identified with, and the story became what it was.
Yeah. Looking ahead to this year, and the story is of a similar level in terms of the human aspect of it. So maybe tell us a bit about the story. So the garden is called A Moment in Time. So tell us a bit about the story of this garden, and then we'll get into the garden itself and what it actually looks like and so on.
Yeah, well, I think in this one, I'll have to bring you back a little bit, but when I started doing the gardens in France in 2018, I was relocated there for about 3.5 months in year one. 2018 was built, 2019 it was inaugurated with the Irish Embassy present and the ambassadors. 21, we started designing the second garden there. In 22, the second garden was completed and inaugurated again with the Irish Embassy. Partway through my first relocation, I was visiting sort of 3 to 4 war memorials, cemeteries, exhibitions per day, to the point that when I came back after the first stint, I didn't speak for about 2 weeks. It has an effect on the brain when you appreciate that the dried up moat of this 13th century castle, which houses Europe's largest war museum within, there's no avoiding the harrowing numbers who passed in the First and Second World Wars, and that you're standing on the ground where, again, bodies still lay underneath. And to design a garden there, which, as they worded it very well, was to be respectful of the past, but with an eye to the future, but to bring the public into a space where they never really wanted to go to, and to allow people to smile. And it's difficult when you consider that the castle fell in the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, and the Second World War. And now, as I said to one journalist, bad things only ever happened in moats. And now the job is to allow people to come in and to maybe hear them smile. And it's a difficult brief. And that was the only brief I got in it. That's the first part. The second part was that they did an exhibition in 2019, I think it was, called Amour or Love, translated in a bad Irish accent, my apologies. And it was a paradoxical exhibition where they explained how the ministries at the time fast-tracked marriages and paired the young soldiers, male all at the time, with a beau or a love that they would want to live longer to return to, which makes perfect sense. But when they returned to this romanticized post-war lady who they'd fallen in love with, the brain was never the same. So where the exhibition becomes a paradox is when they start to show the divorce rates go exponential, because the brain was never the same. They show you the paintings of a guy called Otto Dix. And Otto Dix, it's a harrowing part of the exhibition, and I apologies for overuse of that word, but he shows 2 paintings, and one is the rats going through the skull of the soldier, and the next one is a mutated man, a mutated head with 2 children on his knee looking up at him, and it's how he sort of sees himself. When you get into that, the explanation then is that the soldiers would have written in their notes the effects of the rats going doolally in the trenches, and then the soldiers noting that the same thing was happening to the soldiers themselves. And one of the conversations I had with the director of the castle, Hervé Francois, was that if you have fallen, your name is on a piece of stone. If you've fallen and your body is missing, your name is on a piece of stone. But if you return home and your mind is never the same, then what is the remembrance, if I may word it that? I hope that's polite enough to say it that way. What's a remembrance for you? Mm-hmm. And it sort of stuck with me to how do you translate that into a garden? I don't mean to sound overly artistic, but the idea of it sort of sat in my head. And so fast track to last year, and Melbourne ring me, and it's sort of there's a bit of, will you ask your friend to ask my friend, would you like to dance with me? And they find out that I'm interested in going back, but I never asked them, they never asked me, if that makes sense. but they did, but they didn't, and neither did I. And then we end up in a phone call, Teams call, and they said, what have you got in your head? And I said, I want to put an airplane in a garden. They went, oh. And I said, but I want it 3.5 meters above head height. And they went, oh. And then I said, well, but I want like smoke and lights coming out the top. And they went, and so they ring me the next day and said, we found your plane. I went, you're kidding me. So the first part is you're allowed to do what you want to do. And then the story starts to evolve. And obviously I'm Irish, and this garden, by judging rules, has to have a location. If you understand me, for your listeners who aren't aware, if I say we're basing this garden in Wimbledon in England, and it's a patch of grass related to a tennis court, then it's just a patch of grass, and the judges have to give it gold. It is what it is. When we turn around and say, well, we're choosing the plants based upon a specific location, we have to say it's Southeast Australia. So now it's got a location because of the planting range that we have. And then because of that, we now turn around and go, well, okay, we're getting more pedantic. So we narrow it down to 1984. We narrow it down to then, well, hold on a second, the age of the plane. And then we narrow it down to, well, okay, he's 40 years of age. So that gives him a 84, 44. He would have been born somewhere around post-Second World War or thereabouts. And now we have an era, and nobody has sort of said no. What happened then after subsequently was we ended up in conversations with the Defence Force Welfare Association. They're an independent voice, and they look after veterans who are serving or post-service, if I might word it that. And one of the things they try and do is to highlight the difficulties of those trying to return to what their life was prior to, I guess, or adjusting back into society. And by all accounts, from speaking with them and again, the Semken family, that isn't as easy as it sounds.
Yeah,
that's probably an understatement.
Yeah, well, I can see where you're tying together, going back to the writing on the stone in France for somebody that's fallen, but for the person that has, essentially left the person that they were in that moat and come out the other side, there isn't anything there for them, and this is, this is sort of a replication of that, I suppose, and it's probably something that happens all over the world. So yeah, this garden is, I suppose, in a way honoring that and honoring those people. So
it's a funny one, John, because like if this garden had ended up in, Japan or Singapore or London, the planting range would have changed the things, and we have to professionally, we have to take it seriously on a judging level. And I understand judging rules extremely well. At the same token, the plant choice, which we have to get specific over because it has to be a garden, albeit it tells the story, now makes it about Australia or Australian veterans in this case. I think ultimately what I was initially aiming at, and it's funny, when we were in France, one of the conversations that was had with me, with the media there, was that, what's an Irish guy doing this peace garden for when the Irish didn't fight in this region? And I said, well, incorrect, because if you go 7 miles from Peron to a town called Finn, Fin, there's 2 guys from the Royal Irish Fusiliers. If you go to Thiepval, and they corrected me and said, well, it's French and English only, and in Thiepval, one side and the other, and I said, incorrect. If you go 3 rows in and 5 headstones across, there's the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. There's 1 Irish guy in the middle. And when I was talking about this with the one of the tour guides, external, lovely guy from Wales, and he said, it's a funny thing with the Irish. He said, we can't figure it out. He said, but every cemetery we go to, somewhere in the middle, he said, there's 1 to 2 Irish guy, like headstones, just dotted in an area where they never, inverted commas, fought. And he said, we can't figure it out. He said, it's like as if they went in for a couple of pints. He wasn't stereotyping, I promise you. And he said, came out, missed the bus or got on the wrong one and ended up going in a different location. It just didn't make sense.
Yeah.
But one of the things that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission do, the largest horticultural employer in the world, as by the way, one of the things they do by headstone is it's irrespective of denomination, religion, rank, order, country, origin, anything. Doesn't matter who you are. You're a soldier of the Great War. You lie side by side. But these were ultimately young men. If we go to World War One and Two, anyway, in particular, there were young men who, when this story started to come out, this one now, it's phenomenal the amount of people who came to me and said, my dad flew in the RAF, or my dad went to Australia, or my dad went to France, or my dad fought with them, or my granddad did, because they ultimately needed to earn a living.
Yeah.
And by nobody's choice, sometimes it's just necessary. But when you take away the country or religion or creed or whatever it might be, what you actually get is just a young boy, 17 years of age, like my daughter's 14. In 3 years' time, for her to go to war is mind-blowing, if I'm to consider it at that level. And to put all of this in context, the stats that they've given us, and I'm reading these so I word it correctly, my apologies, but the Defence Force Welfare Association noted to me close to 6,000 or 5.3% of Australia's 500,000 current and former service personnel have experienced homelessness in the past year, a rate 3 times higher than that of the broader population. And the second one is previously serving veterans are more likely to die by suicide than the general population. The suicide rate among female veterans is 107% higher than the general population, and it's nearly 30% higher for men.
Wow.
Yeah, staggering.
Crazy. It's crazy.
Staggering. Now, when I go back and say that's like a 17-year-old or 27-year-old or 37-year-old, and we've known each other a long time, I understand from my research in France that this has struck a chord in Australia, is humbling, and that I'm allowed to retell that story there is humbling again, that nobody has said no, that people have held hands with me on it. Again, I'll pay huge ode to the family that are Semken Landscaping and everyone involved with them. But ultimately, I'm not a politician. I'm a, as my dad would say, I'm a daydreamer who can turn that into an equation and make it real by way of a garden. But I can't sit here and tell somebody not to go to war or don't press the red button, or I can only just sort of build it, take a stand back and hope that you like it or appreciate it, or maybe it opens up a bit of conversation. And it has to be judged, on the other hand. I'm segueing slightly away, but it has to be judged also as a real garden, and we want, for all of the right reasons, to win an appropriate medal, but also tell a bit of a story. So the plane, I reckon, is probably going to get a couple of laughs. That's understood, and that's accepted. I'm old enough and bold enough to appreciate that. But I think it's a sort of an Andy Kaufman. It's a bittersweet in that you see it and then you find the story, and now we've brought you from a high to a low, and that bit is intended. We did it in the last one where you saw the reflection, and again, going by one of the judges who's seen a million show gardens, for her to come with a beaming smile and walk off with tears in her eyes. But for this one, we've already had the phone calls with tears to sort of thank us for what's being done and how it's resonated already. And that's just in text.
Incredible story, and the way they tie together to sort of, we're not moving off the story, but to talk about the garden horticulturally, because I know there's that side of it as well. So describe the garden a little bit. Obviously, you've mentioned this plane. So it's a warplane that's 3.5 meters up in the air. So describe all of this and then the planting and what else is in it, features.
Well, the plane is a small Cherokee plane, and we sort of loosely, just to stick on this one for a second, John, but we loosely based it, or I loosely based it upon my dad after Mom passed, and how I'd walk into the kitchen and the washing would have been stacked up. He still had pride and he was still well dressed, but he should have cut the grass, say, 2-3 weeks beforehand. And the projects that were fixing, say, a part of the roof, that was okay. The cup was cracked, but It still held liquid, so that's okay. But ultimately, if I might speak this of Dad, rest him, he was a bit of a sort of a lost soul. One day sort of rolled into the next, and some things just didn't make as much sense or reason anymore. But the amount of men I know, in particular, my apologies, but the amount of males I know in particular who have things that they should have got to is an elongated tail. And everybody who I say it to, he bought the car 20 years ago, meant to restore it, still in the shed, man passed, but they'll never take it away. It'll always be there. And so that plane sort of represents sort of that in its face in a way. If you look at the illustration of the garden, the grass roof is one of the first parts. And so when I was back in Cairns and Melbourne in November, we met with Lilydale Lawns, and they started growing the weeds in the roof so that it would look a little bit, again, not neglected. He's got pride, but at the same token, even getting them to close their eyes to grow the grass to the right level with the weeds growing in it sort of periodically, they were sown in November, ready for March. And so we've 3 different types of lawn in there. That's one. And then we get into the planting, but the biggest thing probably is the cabin. And the cabin, finding the right incorrect wood so that it looked like it was from 1984, believe me, is a tricky thing. Again, I'll mention the Semkin family repeatedly through this, because I'm obviously in Dublin, and they're sending me photographs saying, what do you think of this one? What do you think of this one? What do you think of this one? But they also said to me, once they told the story, doors just opened, and it's become magic. So they built the shed. Sorry, I say shed. They built the cabin. The getaway, and now they've deconstructed it yesterday at time of recording, and it's ready now to be put onto the back of a truck. By the time I get there, it will be ready to go in. We'll have the crane in. Largest tree, I think, is about 11 meters tall. And then the plane will go 3.5 meters above head height. And again, we're not allowed to dig down in this garden. So that makes supporting a plane above ground level a little bit tricky. You'll appreciate. But look, if we can hold 45,000 litres of water in a garden, a timber structure, without it flooding out the gates, I think we'll be doing pretty okay.
Yeah, brilliant. So planting wise, you've said a huge tree. What else is in there planting wise?
Let me see, because I only got the list in here. My apologies.
Yeah,
Tilia cordata, most people would understand, which is your lime tree.
Yeah,
ulmus and ficus are easy to understand. The angophers and the Cupressus sempervirens, glauca. And then after that, funnily enough, we've an Arbutus unido in there. Osmanthus burkwoodii. I'm trying to pick names that most people would appreciate translated to Ireland. Some euphorbias, ginkgos, pittosporums, cotinus, hydrangeas. And again, I'll say you're trying to reflect a garden that is 1984, a planting style that is 1984. The importance of this is quite simple. From a judging rules perspective, I'll reference the Wimbledon reference again. That's incorrect English. I should punch myself in the face repeatedly now for saying that. But if I design a garden which is just a patch of grass based upon, and I write in my brief, which the public wouldn't see, I write in the brief that's based upon Wimbledon, the judges will look at it and go, well, it's green, it's square, looks like it, smells like it, must be it, gold. The public will say it's boring and hate it for logic reasons. But if I design a garden that says that I wanted to show that I loved her via this garden, the judges can turn around and say, we don't feel that you showed that you loved her enough. That's where it starts to get tricky. And in the last garden, that's why I said we were playing a dangerous game, number one. In this one, it's based on obviously a man who's a little bit, say, lost, just to shorten it down. And in that context, you're now trying to convince a group of judges, not trying to convince them, but it either is or it isn't. It either evokes that feeling or it doesn't. But equally, when they get into the planting, the more times we say, well, it's not just a piece of grass, it's a piece of grass from 1984, it's a piece of grass that has to show X or Y or Z, the more they've an opportunity to sort of take a couple of points off. And that's where I think this one's become a little bit of a dangerous game. Or as I worded to Michael from Warner's Nurseries, if you're going to go out of the industry completely, this is a pretty good way to do it. And you can take from that what you like, but it could well be, pardon my turn of language or my use of language, it could well be ultimate career suicide. And I'm not stupid. I understand. I'll be judging at Melbourne Flower Show as well, not in my own category. But again, I'll say it, I understand judging rules, but I can't change the design. Mm-hmm. And I can't change what I'm trying to do. But at the top of the page, the job is to highlight somebody else. And sometimes that comes with an element caveat. Of risk. Yeah, a grave element of risk. And it comes at the cost of, I guess, my giant-sized ego, if I might say it that way.
Yeah. I suspect it'll go down a treat anyway. It that I don't understand the way you do the judging and how the judging works, but from the way you've described it so far, I think it's definitely going to evoke the emotion, and they will get the story, and I guess that takes you halfway there. So
yeah, well, it's a funny one. Like Martin and Nicole, so Martin Semkin and Nicole, his daughter, who works with him, they're about 80 employees. They're probably the largest contractor in Melbourne. He would have done 3 show gardens there last year, the Welcome Garden, my garden, and another one. I had a meeting with Martin, God, before Christmas, a month later. We have a Royal Australian Air Force calendar from 1984, number 1. We have the old black and white television. These are all the conversations that I was literally rhyming out of my head of how it should be, of how it should feel. Mm-hmm. And one of them was a portable black and white television, maybe about sort of 10 inches by 12 inches, but it's sort of long at the back.
Yeah, about 2 foot deep, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember, I was saying to Martin, I remember watching Arsenal beat Liverpool, self-confessed Arsenal fan, my apologies to all your listeners for that. And my brother holding the coat hanger in the top of it, and my other brother punching him because he moved and the reception went completely wonky.
Yeah,
and it was when Michael Thomas scored that goal for Arsenal to win the league. Anyway, aside.
And I was devastated that night, by the way, because I'm a Liverpool fan.
Well, I knew that, John, and hence why I brought this up intentionally. But I think when we started to set the scene, and Martin phones me and says, I've got it. I went, you got The Meaning of Life, the new DVD collection, what have you got? And he went to the television. The newspapers are from that time, the calendar, the workbench with the record voice built into it, the places where you would have slotted your tools in with a bit of leather, the dust on the floor, the picture frames, the absolutely everything. It'll be like a movie set by the time it's done. And that, I think, again, is sort of testament maybe to the story in text format before illustration was ever done. And we had started building this maybe last September for a March reveal. So like I say, I hope I've done always the right thing by those who I'm trying to stand beside, if that's an eloquent way to word it. I hope so.
Yeah, I suspect you have. So hopefully we're looking at you in a couple of weeks' time with another gold. I know you have some other things planned for Australia, doing some guest lectures. What else is on the agenda over the next few months, even after Australia?
Well, we've two guest lectures. So I'm back at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria. That's the first one. We spoke there last March. via Tim Entwistle, who was the former curator there. And I think I did one more. I can't remember where that one was for the minute. My sincerest apologies. But I think this year we're gone to the Dandenong, and that's Fernie Creek Horticultural Society. And I think they've teamed up with another horticultural society, and so myself and Martin Semkin, funny enough, on this occasion, are doing the lectures together. Last year, sorry, my other one would have been at Melbourne University, and John Rayner was the head of horticulture there, another absolute gentleman. What's on the horizon after that? We've a return to TV with a little known architect who's Irish, called Dermot Bannon. He says jovially, my apologies. And a guy called Julian Benson. So Julian would have been a judge on Dancing with the Stars, amongst other things. Would have danced with Andrew Lloyd Webber and a whole host of other famous things that involve choreography. And Julian has cystic fibrosis, so he's looking at doing a house. He's not looking at doing a house, he's doing. It's being done, it's in the process, the designs are already done. It'll start filming probably about a week ago, and the whole 4-story, 150-year-old Victorian house will be transformed into 4 apartments. So people whose children have CF, if you're living in Galway or Donegal or Limerick, and I'd noticed from my own daughter being in Temple Street, chances are we were sleeping on the floor of a hospital room while she was there. It's how you do it. Some people were sleeping in cars, some people were sleeping in hotels. It's an expensive way to I guess be there for your own child, and this home will give parents a place to come to stay, so that when they need to, completely free. And the whole bill will be done completely free. And what a humbling, again, privilege to be asked to do something like this with some of Ireland's absolute finest. So if anybody wants to get involved, Google Julian Benson Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and drop your name in there and mention my name, and it'd be a pleasure to work with you.
Brilliant. So that's anything else on the horizon? That's a pretty busy year, anyway, a pretty packed year. I know you're heading down to Oz in the next couple of weeks, or the next week maybe.
Yeah, next week I'll be there again for St. Patrick's Day. An unusual sensation having a barbecue on St. Patrick's Day, new to me anyway. And then I think one can of Guinness and then going to bed, because you're up the next day at 5 o'clock in the morning to build or see a show garden come to completion. So I'll buy them Irish, and I appreciate that. And it would be nice to have a day off. Show garden waits for no man, ultimately. I think that's going to take about a month. I'll be there again, and then we come home and take a little bit of a breather. There's, I think, some show garden consultation days on with Roadstone. We'd have a mutual friend in Pa Brennan. What a gentleman, who would have helped us genuinely, funnily enough, and we're back to the New Ross episode, Johnny and Lynn's house, where I would have met him first. And I'll be doing a series of garden design days with them. So if anybody's looking for a sort of a garden design consultation, they usually book out in a day, hour usually. There's only I think it's one slot every 30 minutes, so not too many. And just head to Roadstone and you'll get them there. So I'll be up and down the country for a little bit once I come back. Yeah,
for sure. You're not hard to find online, but if somebody is if somebody is interested in, I suppose what you're telling today is the stitching of a story into a garden. So if someone is, listening and has their own story that they want to stitch in their garden, just tell people where they can find you, or where's the best place to contact you.
Well, before I tell them the best place to contact me, John, and I'm asked this question, or I was asked this question, do you do normal gardens? And the answer is yes, I do. I do very normal gardens, and they are the thing that makes my heart beat a little bit faster. This is a show garden. It's not what I do every single day of the week.
Yeah.
Or as my dad would say, Elvis didn't wear that white suit frying an egg, making a cup of tea on a Sunday morning. It's one of them. We do, inverted commas, normal private gardens, and I'm available for that. And if you want to just Google Peter Donegan garden design, it'll come up for you. Instagram is a decent place to get me. Yeah, and there you go.
Brilliant. So best of luck again down in the Melbourne show again this year. Hopefully, I'm seeing in a couple of weeks' time the gold again. It'll be it was a phenomenal achievement last year. To do back-to-backs would be a phenomenal achievement. So very, very best of luck with that. And thank you very much for coming on Master My Garden podcast.
John, genuinely, always a pleasure. I've never not smiled in your company. You and Chloe Thompson just sit up there as two of the finest. I'm very grateful for what you do for the industry with your podcast. And genuinely, thank you for having me on. It's nice to hold the leaderboard with 3 interviews. The first Irish person ever to achieve such a feat, and that puts medal colour very much down the pecking order on this occasion. But genuinely, always thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
You're very welcome. So that's been this week's episode. A huge thanks to Peter for coming on. 2 fantastic stories. To hear the stories, like it is show garden, as he said, show garden is different. You're trying to set a scene, tell a story, evoke an emotion, and then put that into a garden that people can walk off smiling, as he said, and in some cases walk off in tears, but in a good way. So he seems to have told these stories very well. There are important messages behind the gardens, which is really good. But as he also said, he's a fantastic garden designer. I've seen some of his work up close during that DIY SOS series, and there's always an element of surprise, but they're very, very suited to the person. So if you have anything in your head that you want to get into a garden, just have a chat with him. And that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.